So, getting to the root of this sort of safe, horny phenomenon here, where does it exactly come from? Well, you know what? That's pretty easy. It's the gay, woke liberals who are putting chemicals in the water to turn the friggin' frogs gay.
Serious crap! I'm sick of being social engineered. It's not funny!
So, thanks for listening, and goodbye, guys. And remember, guys, if you like the kind of content I make here, I joke a bit, but while I do think there is an ideological angle to this sort of aesthetics trend, honestly, I don't think it's core to the issue. What really motivated me to cover this topic in a video was thinking more deeply about it and about the trends in sexual aesthetics, as well as the overall attitude of our culture towards sex in general. So get out your blue hair dye and your nose rings and get ready to dive into some gender studies 101 here. I think specifically when it comes to any sort of terminally online discourse, there's a tendency towards hyperfixation of causes and effects. This sort of reactionary impulse leads to easy answers, but not very satisfying ones for me. As I said before, it's undoubtable that there is an implicit ideological angle when it comes to the way media is produced and presented to the public, as media is always connected with its creators' intentions. That being said, however, it's impossible to ignore the wider social dialectic at play here. Why exactly are people upset? The people who protest this stuff are not just some stupid incel who are mad for no reason. And the people producing this sort of content are not just sinister, feminist communists who want to punish men. Rather, in my opinion, this issue of sexual display and representation falls into a far deeper and older issue of our culture and class divides, which persist even despite repeated attempted revolutions to combat them. For me, I see the deepest parallels in the situation we face today in that of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, at least in the English-speaking world, and how our notions of sex and desire rapidly change with the rise of industry and new economic conditions. We increasingly live in an era of Neo-Victorians. What online chuds call safe horny is the sexual expression of these same people, or rather a re-emergence of what Foucault called bourgeois sexuality, which has a hyperfixation on things like identification and domestication of sexual desire, leading to a sterile and often analytical form of expression, as opposed to the more classical and visceral eros of maybe earlier eras in Western history. I use this term Neo-Victorians very intentionally, as in this case, I'm specifically talking about English culture. So no need to respond with something like, we don't do that in Germany. So before we get into this, however, let's actually try to define this idea first. What does safe horny mean exactly? What makes something sexually safe, or by contrast, maybe unsafe? It's more difficult than you might think to define this, as although there are often accusations thrown around quite often, they are not always very obviously consistent. Lady Dimitrescu from Resident Evil The Village is one of the first examples that comes to most people's minds, and probably the first example where I actually heard of this term being used. But for a more recent example, at least as of the time of writing this, I've heard some of the designs in the game Hades 2 described this way, and even Baldur's Gate 3, which might surprise some people as it seems quite sexually forward, at least to me at first glance, considering it has things like fully animated sex scenes and nudity, while something that is often seen as sexually unsafe, like for example Stellar Blade, doesn't. I think this last comparison is pretty revealing, as it reveals what the true issue is here rather than what it seems to be on the surface. That is, a porno-hungry boy's desire for just having more tits and asses in gaming. To put it bluntly, a character like Lady Dimitrescu represents what one might consider a kind of dominant other, while the protagonist of Stellar Blade is more of a traditional object, which is totally subject to the will of the player. Another comparison could be that of Mass Effect 1, which was honestly raked over the coals in 2007 for some blue side boob, and the general approach it had towards, male and female relations in that and the following games of the trilogy. So much so that when they were remastered, there was a lot of censoring and other changes made to somewhat mitigate these concerns for the modern audience. I think the real difference between these examples is power more than presentation. What we might call safe horny is always about placing the object of one's desire on a pedestal of some sort of power, while the one seeking that object, mainly you, is symbolically less powerful in the relationship. This could be through things like making the object of desire literally larger and physically stronger, more aggressive, or more self-determined, regardless of their interaction with the subject of desire. It creates a very one-sided relationship, and one which, despite any overtly erotic presentation, often leaves the interaction feeling a little bit hollow, as if there's no deeper weight or teeth behind it. Otherwise, in some cases, it makes one feel almost like a child who needs to be coddled and patronized. In Mass Effect, by contrast, you as Shepard are in an innately powerful position, being the captain of a ship and responsible for its crew and, of course, your team. I'd even argue the player's choice of Shepard being male or female is largely irrelevant, as both are really literally the same character, in the same social position, following the same plot lines. They basically fill the same sort of role, regardless of gender in this situation. Shepard always has power over his subordinates, both physically and socially, which is fitting as he is filling a heroic leader sort of archetype. In fact, I'd say the defining feature of the Mass Effect trilogy's plot is dealing with Shepard as an archetypal power figure, how he chooses to wield that power, including when it comes to his relationships, both sexual and platonic. Speaking of platonic relationships, I think the series also does a great job at representing some of the best examples of this idea in the form of certain characters, for example, like Garrus or even Rex, who, of course, today, especially Garrus, is a major fan favorite. And I think it's specifically for this reason, how well they handled that sort of relationship. While I don't want to turn this entirely into a discussion about Mass Effect only, I do think it handles its various relationships quite well, preserving player autonomy as well as Shepard as a power figure who likewise is saddled with a grave responsibility for all those under his paternal governance. His status almost as a Confucian patriarch, I think is best exemplified with the suicide mission in Mass Effect 2, where the very life and death of his crew and loved ones comes down directly to the use of his power and his personal responsibility, or lack thereof. Now, while I give Mass Effect as a successful example of this sort of dynamic, in my opinion, it does start to fall apart in the later games, where Shepard's role as a literal shepherd starts to matter a lot less and less, as he becomes more like a sort of Mary Sue type character who can kind of just do whatever he wants and be loved or praised regardless. There are a lot of other games, of course, which are far worse in this respect, but this is just to note that going too far in the direction of pure power fantasy is also not really a good thing either. Moving on, when it comes to this idea of safety, it is often less a case of physical safety from abuse, but rather safety from attachment and overall diffusion of risk. Today, people are far less risk tolerant than really ever before, and in the case of relationships or even our own desires, these are often the most risky things we can really engage with. It may seem bizarre to say this, as it simultaneously seems as if many, especially young people, tend to risk quite a lot daily. Nonetheless, I'd argue that these more day-to-day risks, like partaking in drugs, casual sex, or gambling, are far too abstract, as well as they are immediately pleasurable. Thus, the feeling of deeper dread from a future threat is lessened, as is the initial investment as well. I think, again, Mass Effect handled this idea really well, with several of its persistent relationships that can continue between the various games, which in turn give a deeper window into what kind of person Shepard is, as played by you. Now, to return to my earlier point, I think this idea of sexual safety is very deeply tied with something Michel Foucault labels as bourgeois sexuality, which he saw as most obviously manifest in the likes of Freud and the late Victorian sort of Edwardian era in general. For any Americans listening who are unfamiliar with regnal dating systems, this roughly correlates with the late 19th, early 20th centuries in the English world, or at least the Commonwealth. To give some background, Foucault today is very influential in the realms of things like gender studies and academia, as well as queer politics more broadly. However, I don't think it's wise to simply ignore his work, even if you disagree with these contemporary issues. While he mostly sought to understand and diagnose the social structures of his own era, rather than being resolved as some people today might like to imagine, I think the features he identified have only grown deeper and more rigid. In my opinion, the criticism Foucault puts toward this bourgeois form of sexuality is incredibly similar to that hurled against the safe horny expression today, though with much less vitriol, I should say. He describes how the forces of the Industrial Revolution and changes in the economic system from the Middle Ages to the modern era in Europe specifically led to a total reevaluation of how people think about sex and also their own identity. His assertion was that prior to the modern era, people largely didn't identify with anything similar to sexuality at all. Sex was just something people did. It was treated as an act rather than a state of being. And your gender, well, for one, it didn't exist. You were just like whatever you were presented as or biologically, and that was it. So there wasn't this analytical understanding of sex and sexuality as there is today. This does carry weight, in my opinion at least, as even the Catholic Church today, which is of course an ancient institution, still holds this idea that actions hold primacy over one's specific internal identity, which is why it tends to hold anyone seen as actively sexually deviant in far lower regard than someone who merely identifies with a certain group or in a certain way. For the rising merchant and professional class of the Industrial Revolution, self-control, internalization of desire, and an analytical approach to this new idea of sexuality rose to prominence as the older, more vulgar ideas of sex for the sake of maybe some romantic notions or pleasure alone were seen as just gross and inefficient. With time, you only saw this more vulgar and primitive attitude retained by basically the lower classes, though increasingly less so as norms precipitated downwards. This concept of norms or normative power is another key idea in understanding Foucault. For him, the will to power is not merely your ability to literally repress that of others, but rather the more subtle power of norms and how they are first seeded, then enforced willingly by the bulk of society. While there's often state-level enforcement of said norms, think about the Islamic Republic of Iran, for example, the majority of adherence is gained from the passive acceptance and domesticality of the population at large. Increasingly, we no longer need a policeman to enforce some sort of public decency. Now the policeman is living in your head, rent-free. Now, the great outlier in this continuum from the dawn of the Industrial Revolution until now is arguably the mid-20th century sort of sexual revolution, where ideas of pluralism and sexual openness proliferated and arguably became culturally dominant for a time. When many people, I think, today look back at the good old days of the 70s, 80s, 90s culture and media, they often forget that the fact that all of this comes out of the milieu of those children of the 1960s and these new norms provided by the free love era. Things like an increased acceptance of nudity, of physicality in general, and of sex in general in Anglo-American culture. The rise and general openness of mass market porno, and more broadly, a general comfort with discussions about sex. Many of the people who worked in the games industry of this era were, of course, deeply influenced by this. I mean, notably, Sierra Online would literally host orgies and drug parties at their offices. Something to note, however, when looking backward is how narrow this segment of society who was actively participating in this was. While the cultural influence has indeed trickled downwards, this was undoubtedly an elite movement, which primarily catered to and benefited the wealthy. Even the very idea of like free love and living in some sort of sex commune in the woods is frankly absurd to anyone who isn't from an incredibly rich background. One can paint this entire movement as almost a sort of elite rebellion against the broader bourgeois social norms, which has since swallowed up whatever vitality remains of the so-called revolution. The reason I say the Victorians have not gone anywhere is that for all the revolutions of sex and society, every single one of them has been swallowed up and repurposed to suit the needs of capital and class order. While the specifics of our social norms have maybe changed, the actual structure and the repressive effect that it has have not. Any people out there still practicing free love are basically confined to places of extreme secrecy, think like Epstein's Island, where they have in turn grown ever more perverse and honestly a little bit out of control. If you wanted to live a libertine, bohemian lifestyle today, you better hope for the financial support of your billionaire family, to say the least. Thus today, despite on the surface being much more open and enlightened about sexuality than really ever before in history, society simultaneously seems to be more sexless and cold than ever was as well. Instead of a liberation, society has become even more analytical and more detached than it ever was in the days of Freud, for example. Sex and gender studies are gigantic academic disciplines where people pile over research papers and endless books. Meanwhile, fewer people than ever in modern history are even having sex at all. I think if Foucault were alive today, this would probably be his worst nightmare. More like a sick joke on him personally. Wherever there's discourse on why people aren't having sex, it's always treated as the fault of some particular group, or just vague systematic pressures. But in reality, I think it's a collective risk aversion and fear of having to deal with any sort of harm whatsoever. Happiness and unhappiness are sisters, and even twins. They'd either grow up together or remain small together. Friedrich Nietzsche. Foucault gave us a vision of this prison, the panopticon as he puts it. To understand the man inside the prison, I instead look to the last man, the man who prefers the sterile, analytical safety and comfort of the modern norm. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche outlines his concept of the last man, or rather the diametric opposite of his overman concept. This idea of a human is one who rejects all forms of responsibility and much rather subsume himself within the wider norms of his society, especially if they provide a framework of docility and sterility, which are the values that he himself is defined by. To this person, everything superhuman, uplifting, and archetypal appears to him as a form of sickness or insanity. The comparison Nietzsche himself makes is that of maybe a small pond and that of the ocean, where because while the pond is hopelessly polluted by an influx of dirt, the sea can absorb a dirty stream endlessly without itself becoming dirty. The last man likewise doesn't want to or cannot become the sea, as he doesn't want the complexity or the dirt of real human nature. He wants the pond, which is small, isolated, and safe above all. Foucault himself deeply intertwines his work with that of Nietzsche, both as an elaboration and a critique. The concept of bourgeois sexuality, which is the natural impulse of this sort of Neo-Victorian type, scorns any representation of archetypal strength, beauty, or power, which stems from somewhere else beyond the norms set by his society. By exclusively locking oneself into a realm of sexual safety and sterility, one in turn locks oneself off from any sort of higher ideal. Coming back to our current discourse, you can see the same dialogue at play when it comes to the public critique of any sort of representation of a figure of, again, archetypal beauty or power, that it's unrealistic or that it's problematic. Or by contrast, from the other side of things, when a representation is seen as maybe pandering towards women or homosexuals, that it's innately woke or part of some sort of like communist agenda. I mentioned criticisms of Baldur's Gate 3 earlier, although personally I don't think it's even close to being a prime example of the worst aspects of Safe Horny. However, I think the way it handled its characters was quite good at times. It really varies. I mean, some of them I think were very good. Some of them I would say were a little bit lacking. Asterion being a great example of a character which was accused of being there for just like gay pandering, who I think was handled quite well and of course is easily a fan favorite now. For myself, I personally enjoyed when I played the game, the Dark Urge storyline, how interacted with that of Shadow Hearts, being almost mirrored paths of one another. Basically, what I'm saying is the best kind of romance stories are the I can save her or I can fix him ones. And this is like the best of both of those. Now, speaking of archetypes and Nietzsche's ideas on desire, I'd like to move on to something I mentioned at the start of this video, which also represents a very common criticism coming from the more feminist point of view. That of woman as an object of possession. I mentioned Stellar Blade as an example of this. Perhaps something like maybe classic Tomb Raider might be as well. The fact that in all the games, Lara never has an NPC love interest, except for the one most hated by fans, which is Angel of Darkness, kind of gives credence to this idea of her possession by the player. Anyone who's a fan of the Persona series would also have an idea of what I'm talking about here. The biggest troll you can do for Persona fans is suggesting that the female characters should have a male NPC love rival of sorts, who will take them away if you choose not to pursue their romance plotline. Feel free to suggest this if you ever want to see some fatless fan literally explode. The other type of female as possession trope comes in the more classic storyline of a protagonist saving a female counterpart from some sort of danger. Be it maybe a dragon, maybe fate itself, or maybe even from being frozen in stasis within a giant crystal. Trigger warning here, but Crystal from Star Fox Adventures, of course, being the ultimate example of a damsel in distress that led to nuclear levels of seething in the aftermath for even till this day. This sort of objectification is in many ways even more damning than the one I gave as a previous example. However, it exists for a reason, I think, across all spheres of fiction for both men and women, and even in real life to a degree. Both as a survival strategy and as a way to attract attention from others, including sexual attention, women often have a tendency to exaggerate their own weakness. While it's true that the average woman is physically less robust than the average man, I will say averages are not really indicative of reality. In reality, there are many cases where women are physically not that much different from the men around them. And when it comes to things like labor in our modern world, women are by and large able to do many of the jobs that men can do with very few issues. But as anyone who has been in a relationship with a woman can tell you, many do deeply appreciate this sort of strength-weakness dynamic sort of role play, even if it's a little bit performative. This warrior and damsel archetype simply plays into the most extreme version of that same sort of day-to-day performance. And I disagree with the notion that is inherently abusive or even undesirable for most people. Humans are not unlike birds in that nearly everything related to sex with us is some sort of performance. And our myths reflect this. Men want to be strong and to be seen as strong. And many women want to be seen as vulnerable, even if they are not literally so. It's only in the world of the last men where everyone is afraid to be anything at all. So the default is not even towards weakness, but towards just like barrenness and hollowed out people. To delve a bit further, what is held up in opposition to this vulgar idea of possession is one of so-called mutual transactions, a very kind of capitalist idea where desire to possess or be possessed is filtered exclusively through commodity markets, from things like pornography to OnlyFans to things like gacha being a perfect example. Human feelings of desire and the will to exert one's power is almost exclusively channeled through extremely abstract networks such as these. Instead of serving to further mediate desire or provide a safe outlet for it, instead it furthers this process of internalization and depersonalization as people become only further detached from the reality of the flesh and of human relations, rather falling into an increasingly synthetic world where these interpersonal dynamics can be ever more strictly monitored and controlled. In many ways, this is the ultimate safe interaction that far exceeds the public face of the, again, Neo-Victorian form of sexualization, in that it both creates an aura of shame and perversion around everyone involved, while simultaneously caging any genuine eros in this sort of sterile box of limited interactions. The irony, of course, is that many who rail against woke censorship are the primary consumers here. They trade the unsafe and often visceral nature of genuine interaction for the safe sterility of a waifu who exists only because they swiped a credit card. To sum it up for you, to me, this concept of safe horny is entirely about emotional weakness and submission, an extreme focus on internal narratives and homogeneity of both the body and the mind. Just as in the 19th and 20th centuries where men and women were homogenized in their respective boxes for the sake of streamlining capital production, so today this process has merely continued with a few hiccups towards a state where all humans, regardless of sex, are simply homogenized into a state of introverted domesticity. The bourgeois elements, even self-proclaimed leftist ones, actively participate in this homogenization as it serves their class interests to enforce this sort of unilateral herd mentality. Likewise, on the contemporary political right, there's absolutely no real pushback on this. At most, some desire to simply roll back the process maybe a decade or two so they can catch up. In both cases, this only serves to perpetuate repression under the guise of alleviating maybe some surface level aspect of it. Safe horny is the sexual expression of the totally abstract individual, a faceless instrumentalization. While in my opinion it was ultimately a failure, the spirit of the 60s, which continued among the hippies and the yuppies of Silicon Valley and later the technological boom, was not initially just physical, but spiritual as well, about embracing love and physicality as an ideal, rather than just some act or something like sexuality, which needs to be studied under a microscope. The real issue here is not with woke, as the metaphor is perfectly accurate. Once people have awoken to something, they can't really just pretend it didn't happen. But rather, what do we do next? Trying to manipulate the herd mentality towards your own specific niche interest really achieves nothing of any substance ever. And I'm sorry to say that basically nothing in the entire sexual revolution of the past maybe 50, 60, 70 years has made any real meaningful changes to society beyond just, again, the surface level, in my opinion. Rather, I think, much like in the case of Zarathustra, Nietzsche's diagnosis, which is again echoed by Foucault as well, is for a life unfiltered and unbound. Not totally succumbing to desires like some addict to the point where it incapacitates your ability to function anymore, but not shying away from showing your own rawness as well. In this respect, archetypes serve as signposts for us to help us in our own striving to overcome ourselves and the herd. Heroic ideals which force us to look up rather than just sterile homunculi which force our necks downwards. And remember guys, if you like the kind of content I make here, remember to like the video and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out a lot. But either way guys, I'll see you again next time. So goodbye everyone.